Fantastica. Hey everybody, welcome to Hot Dad Reads. We're starting an hour early because we're gonna run for an extra hour. Because, why not? That goes like that. That goes like that. Doop doo, doop doo. Starting the stream. Very good. Hi. You know how it's Hot Dad Reads? Well, the dad part's ahead of the read part. That's the way that I describe it. So, sometimes you just gotta struggle all day with a child who would not take a nap. And then she falls asleep. You're like, oh, good. And then she wakes up that night because she's teething and... Ooh, teething. So, lots of that. Like you do. So, sorry we missed a couple days. It's just been exhausting and whatnot. Now we're taking a risk today of hey, let's do a 2-hour stream. It won't still keep going on. But yeah, it's a risk we're going to take. We are inside of Les Miserables. We're on chapter 7, book 2, part 1, what have you. And I just want to... The connection between these chapters is great, so let me just start back a little bit. Jean Valjean went into the prison hulks, sobering... I can't read. Jean Valjean went into the prison hulks, sobbing and trembling. He came out emotionless. He went in despairing. He came out dour. What had happened inside that soul? Chapter 7, Inside Despair. Let us try to describe it. It is surely incumbent on society to examine these things, since it is society that creates them. He was, as we have said, an educated man, but he was no fool. There was the light of natural intelligence in him. Hardship, which sheds a light of its own, increased the little illumination there was in that soul. Under the rod, the chains, in solitary confinement, in exhaustion, under the burning sun of penal servitude, on the convict's plank bed, he turned in on himself and reflected. He set himself up as a court of justice. He began by sitting in judgment on himself. He recognized that he was not an innocent man unjustly punished. He admitted that he had committed a drastic and reprehensible deed, that he probably would not have been refused the loaf of bread had he asked for it, that in any case it would have been better to wait and rely on pity or work to obtain it. That is not an utterly conclusive argument to say, can hunger be kept waiting? That, in the first place, it is very rare for anyone literally to die of hunger, and anyway, regrettably or not, human beings are so constituted that they are capable of suffering a great deal for a long time, morally and physically, without dying. That patience was necessary, that it would have been better even for those poor little children, that it was an act of madness for a miserable wretch such as he to take on the whole of society and to imagine that theft was a way out of poverty, that under any circumstances the gateway that led to criminality was a bad escape route from poverty. In short, he had done wrong. Then he asked himself the following: whether he was the only one at fault in his fateful story. Whether, firstly, it was not a serious matter that, hard-working as he was, he had no work, conscientious as he was, he had no bread, and whether after he confessed the crime he had committed, the punishment had not been harsh and disproportionate, whether there had not been greater wrong perpetrated by the law through the penalty inflicted than by the culprit through his offense, whether one of the scale pans had not been overladen, the one that weighed expiation, whether the excessively heavy penalty did not cancel out the offense and did not result in reversing the situation, in replacing the delinquent's offense with the offense of repression, and making the guilty man the victim, and the debtor the creditor, and in ultimately vindicating the one who had broken the law. Whether this penalty compounded with successive supplementary sentences for the attempted escapes did not end up becoming some kind of assault on the strong against the weak, of the strong against the weak, a crime of society against the individual, a crime that recommenced every day, a crime that went on for 19 years. He wondered whether human society could possibly be entitled to inflict on its members both its unconscionable improvidence on the one hand and its ruthless providence on the other, and to trap a poor man forever between want and excess, want of work and excess of punishment. Whether it was not outrageous that society should treat in this manner precisely those least favored by the chance distribution of assets, and consequently those most deserving of care. Having raised and answered these questions, he passed judgment on society and condemned it. He condemned it to his hatred. He held it responsible for the fate he suffered, and told himself that he might not hesitate to make it answerable one day. He determined that there was no proportionality between the wrong he had done and the wrong done to him. Lastly, he concluded that his punishment was not strictly speaking a miscarriage of justice, but it was most certainly iniquitous. Hi, Kitty. I love you. I have to do a lot of reading and your hair is going in my mouth. And I think if I toss you away, you're just going to come back. So let's make a deal, okay? Don't get hair on me. Good. We have an accord, this cat and I. How... Why is it flickering? Stop flickering. It's gonna... I got time. Oh, anyway. Yeah. All right. Anger may be foolish and absurd. It is possible to be unjustifiably incensed. A man is outraged only when, one way or another, he is basically in the right. Jean Valjean felt outraged. After all, human society had done him nothing but harm. This angry face that it calls justice, and that it presents to those it smites, was the only one he had ever seen. The only reason other people had ever laid a finger on him was to hurt him. He had had no physical contact with anyone that had not been a blow struck against him. Never since childhood, since his mother, his sister, had he ever encountered a friendly word, a look of kindness. With every succeeding injury, he had gradually come to the firm belief that life is a war, and in this war he was the vanquished. He had no other weapon than his hatred. He resolved to hone it in prison and to take it with him when he left. There was at Toulon a school for convicts run by the Ignorantine friars, where the basics were taught to any of those poor wretches willing to learn. He was one of the willing. He went to school at the age of 40 and learned to read, write, and count. He felt that to strengthen his intelligence was to strengthen his hatred. In certain cases, education and enlightenment may serve to extend the scope of evil. It is sad to say that, having passed judgment on the society that had been his undoing, he passed judgment on the providence that had created that society, and this providence, too, he condemned. So during those 19 years of torture and slavery, this soul both rose and fell. Light penetrated it on the one side, darkness on the other. As we have seen, Jean Valjean was not a bad person by nature. He was still good when he arrived at the prison. There, he condemned society and felt he was becoming wicked. There, he condemned Providence and felt he was becoming ungodly. At this point, it is hard not to pause for reflection. Does human nature change so thoroughly and so radically? Can the human being created good by God be made wicked by man? Can the soul be completely remade by fate and, being ill-fated, become ill-natured? Can the heart grow deformed and develop incurable ugliness and infirmities under the pressure of inordinate misfortune, like the spine under too low a vault? Is there not in every human soul, who is not in the soul of Jean Valjean in particular, an original spark, a divine element, incorruptible in this world, immortal in the next, which goodness is capable of nurturing, stoking, kindling, fanning into a glorious blaze of brilliance, and which evil can never wholly extinguish? Yeah, cat hair. Yeah, I'm picking on you. Grave and perplexing questions, to the latter of which any physiologist would probably have answered no, without hesitation, had he seen this sullen convict in Toulon at moments of rest, which, for Jean Valjean, were moments for rumination. Seated, with his arms folded on the bar of some capstan, and the end of his chain stuffed into his pocket to prevent it from dragging. Serious, silent and thoughtful, one ostracized by the legal system, who looked with anger on his fellow men. One doomed by civilization, who looked with rancor on heaven. Certainly, and we would not wish to disguise the fact, the physiologist observing this would have seen before him a wretchedness beyond salvation. He might perhaps have pitied this sick man of the law's making, but he would not have attempted any treatment. He would have averted his gaze from the cavernous depths he had glimpsed in this soul, and the word hope, albeit written by the finger of God on the brow of every man, he, like Dante at the portals of hell, would have banished from this existence. Was the state of his soul, which we have tried to analyze, as perfectly plain to Jean Valjean as we have tried to portray it to our readers? Did Jean Valjean see distinctly after their development, and had he seen distinctly as they developed, all the elements of which his moral wretchedness consisted? Had this rough and uneducated man a true understanding of the chain of thought that had led him, step by step, up and down, to the dismal prospect that had for so many years already constituted the inner horizon of his spirit? Was he fully conscious of everything that had gone on inside him, and everything stirring within him? This we would not dare to say. Indeed, we believe not. There was too much ignorance in Jean Valjean for there not to remain a great deal of confusion, even after so much misery. At times, he did not rightly know what he felt. Jean Valjean was in darkness. He suffered in darkness. He hated in darkness. He might be said to have made his way by hatred. He was used to living in this darkness, groping like a blind man, a dreamer. Only every now and again there came all at once, from within him or from without, a surge of anger, an intensification of suffering, a pale flash of lightning that lit up his whole soul and suddenly made visible all around him, in front and behind, by the glimmerings of a ghastly brightness, the frightful precipices and bleak perspectives of his destiny. After the lightning, darkness would fall again. And where was he? He could no longer tell. It is in the nature of such punishment, in which what prevails is the pitiless, in other words, the brutalizing, to transform a man little by a kind of stupid transfiguration into a wild beast, sometimes a ferocious beast. Jean Valjean's persistent attempts at escape alone would suffice to prove this strange working of the law on the human soul. Completely useless and foolish as these attempts were, Jean Valjean would have kept on making them as often as the opportunity presented itself without, for one moment, considering the outcome or his previous existence. He escaped impetuously, like the wolf that finds the cage open. Instinct told him, flee. Reason would have said, stay. But in the face of so strong a temptation, reason disappeared. All that remained was instinct. The beast alone acted. When he was recaptured, the further punishments inflicted on him only served to make him wilder still. One detail we must not fail to mention is that he possessed a physical strength far exceeding that any other inmate of the prison hulks. Paying out a cable or winding a capstan, Jean Valjean could take the strain of 4 men. He sometimes lifted and supported enormous weights on his back, and in cases of necessity acted as a substitute for that implement known as a cric, a jack, in the past called an orgueil, from which incidentally the name of Rue Montorgueil, near the Central Market in Paris, derives. His comrades had nicknamed him Jean le Cric. Once, when repairs were being made to the balcony of Toulon's City Hall, one of Puget's splendid caryatids that supported the balcony became dislodged and almost fell. Jean Valjean, who happened to be there, took the caryatid's weight on his shoulder, giving the workmen time to get there. His litheness was even greater than his robustness. Certain convicts, perpetually dreaming of escape, in the end become truly expert in combining strength and agility. It is an expertise in the muscles, a whole mysterious discipline of statics is daily practiced by prisoners, those who are eternally envious of flies and birds. To climb a sheer surface and find purchase where it was almost impossible to see any protrusion was child's play to Jean Valjean. Given the corner of a wall, by tensing his back and his thighs, fitting his elbows and heels into any unevenness in the stone, he could hoist himself as if by magic to the 3rd floor. Sometimes he climbed right up onto the roof of the prison in this way. He did not say much. He did not laugh. It took some very strong emotion to wring from him once or twice a year that lugubrious laughter of the convict that sounds like an echo of the devil's laughter. By the look of him, his gaze seemed forever to dwell on something terrible. He was, indeed, preoccupied. Through the morbid perceptions of a deficient nature and a defeated mind, he had an obscure feeling that some monstrous thing bore down on him. In that dim and pallid half-light in which he skulked, every time he craned his neck and tried to look up, he perceived with terror and rage combined, stacked in layer upon layer above him, rising with dreadful steepness as far as the eye could see, a frightful accumulation, as it were, of things, laws, prejudices, men, and deeds, whose contours he could not distinguish, whose mass terrified him, and which was nothing other than that monumental pyramid we call civilization. In this swarming, shapeless mass he could pick out here and there, now close to him, now far away on inaccessible levels, some grouping, some brightly illuminated detail. Here the prison warden and his rod, there the gendarme and his saber. Beyond, the mitred archbishop, the mitred archbishop. Right at the top, like a sort of sun, the crown and dazzling emperor. It seemed to him like these distant splendors, far from dispelling his darkness, made it blacker and more dismal. Laws, prejudices, deeds, men, things, all this came and went above him, observing the complicated and mysterious movement God imparts to civilization, trampling and crushing him with an indefinable calm in its cruelty and an inexorability in its indifference. Souls foundering in the worst possible plight, poor wretches lost in the lowest depths of this limbo where no one looks anymore, the law's outcasts feel individually burdened with the whole weight of this human society, so forbidding to anyone outside it, so appalling to anyone at the bottom of it. In this situation, Jean Valjean pondered. What could be the nature of his reflections? If the grain of millet beneath the millstone were capable of thinking, it would no doubt have thought as Jean Valjean did. All these things, realities full of phantasmagoria full of realities, had eventually created in him an inner state of a kind that was almost indescribable. At times, in the midst of his penal labor, he would pause, then fall to thinking. His reason, at once more mature and more confused than in the past, would rebel. Everything that had happened to him seemed absurd. Everything that surrounded him seemed impossible. He said to himself, "This is a dream." He would gaze at the prison warden standing a few paces away. The prison warden seemed as a specter. Suddenly the specter would beat him with his rod. The natural world hardly existed for him. It would almost be true to say that for Jean Valjean there was no sun, no fine summer days, or radiant sky, or fresh April dawns. It was some basement dinginess that normally lit his soul. In conclusion, to sum up what can be summed up and translated into concrete results in all that we have just mentioned, we shall simply remark that, thanks to the way prison had molded him, Jean Valjean, the inoffensive tree pruner from Faverolles, the dreadful felon of Toulon, had, after 19 years, become capable of two kinds of misdeed. First, a swift, unthinking kind, full of impulsiveness, entirely instinctive, a reprisal of sorts for the wrong done to him. Second, a grave and serious kind, consciously considered and planned with the mistaken notions such adversity can instill. His premeditations went through 3 successive phases, a progress which only natures of a certain quality are capable: rationalization, resolve, determination. His motives were outrage, that had become a habit of mind, the bitterness of his heart, a deep sense of the iniquities he had suffered, the impulse to react, even against the good, the innocent and the just, if there be any. The point of departure and of arrival in all his thinking was his hatred of human law. A hatred that, if not arrested in its development by some providential occurrence, becomes within a given time hatred of society, then hatred of the human race, then hatred of creation, and is reflected in an ill-defined, constant, and brutal desire to inflict harm on no matter whom, on any living creature. As we can see, it was not without reason that Jean Valjean's passport described him as a very dangerous man. Year by year, his soul had hardened slowly but inexorably. The hard-hearted are dry-eyed. When he left prison, he had not shed a tear for 19 years. Just to point out here what Victor Hugo already wrote. The point of departure and of arrival in all his thinking was his hatred of human law. A hatred that, if not arrested in its development by some providential occurrence, becomes within a given time a hatred of society, then hatred of the human race, then hatred of creation, and is reflected in an ill-defined, constant, and brutal desire to inflict harm on no matter whom, on any living creature. Because if you want to be anti-racist, you can criticize policies, but don't criticize people. So being mad at human law, sure, but unchecked, then it becomes hatred against society and people and creation. So, Victor Hugo saying things that are still quite quite poignant today. So, criticize policy, love people. Chapter 8, The Deep and the Dark. Man overboard. So what? The ship does not stop. The wind blows. This woeful vessel has a course it is compelled to keep. It passes on. The man disappears, then reappears. He sinks and rises to the surface again. He calls for help. His arms reach out. No one hears. The ship, shuddering under the gale, is entirely concentrated on its handling. The crew and the passengers do not even see the man in the water. His pathetic head is but a speck in the enormity of the waves. He utters desperate cries in the troughs. What a ghostly vision that retreating sail is. He watches and watches in panic. It grows distant. It dims. It dwindles. He was there only a moment ago. He was one of the crew. He went to and fro on the deck with the others. He had his share of fresh air and sunlight. He was alive. Now, what has happened? He has slipped. He has fallen. It is gone. He is in the monstrous waters. He has nothing underfoot anymore but shifting and treacherousness. The billows, torn and chopped by the wind, surround him hideously. The heavings of the heap overwhelm him. All the watery raggedness thrashes round his head. A mob of waves spews over him. Blurred openings half devour him. Every time he goes under, he glimpses precipices filled with darkness. Frightful alien vegetation seize him, bind his feet, draw him towards them. He feels that he is becoming the deep. He is part of the spume. The waves toss him from one to another. He drinks bitterness. The craven ocean is furiously intent on drowning him. Hugeness toys with him as he perishes. It seems as if all this water were hatred. Nevertheless, he puts up a fight. He tries to defend himself. He tries to keep above the water. He strives. He swims. He, this puny force, immediately, exhausted, combats the inexhaustible. Where, then, is the ship? Over there, barely visible in the pale obscurity of the horizon. The wind gusts. All the spray beats down on him. He looks up and sees only the lividness of the clouds. He is a dying witness to the immense frenzy of the sea. He is tormented by this craziness. He hears noises unknown to man that seem to come from beyond the earth and from some dreadful, untold outer region. There are birds in the clouds, just as there are angels above human tribulations. But what can they do for him? They fly, sing, and soar, while he draws his dying breath. He feels simultaneously buried by those two infinities, the ocean and the darkness. The one is a tomb, the other a shroud. Darkness falls. He has been swimming for hours. He has no strength left. That ship, that distant thing in which there were men, has vanished. He is alone in the tremendous twilight chasm. He sinks, he stiffens, he writhes, he senses beneath him the huge undulations of the invisible. He calls out, "Of men there are none. Where is God?" He shouts, "Someone! Someone!" He keeps on shouting. Nothing on the horizon. Nothing in the heavens. He implores the expanse, the waves, the seaweed, the rocks. They are deaf. He beseeches the tempest. The insensate tempest obeys only the infinite. Around him darkness, mist, loneliness, churning and mindless tumult, and endless billowing of untamed waters. Within him horror and weariness. Beneath him the downward drop. Nothing to hold to. He imagines the corpse's murky fortunes in the unbounded gloom. The bottomless cold paralyzes him. His hands clench and close and seize on nothing. Unavailing winds, clouds, waterspouts, breezes, stars. What can he do? The despairing man gives up. He who is weary opts to die. He relinquishes. He surrenders. He lets go. And there he is forevermore, buffeted in the dismal depths of perdition. O implacable march of human societies, the men and souls lost along the way, ocean in which all who are dropped by the law sink, dire failure of rescue, O moral death. The sea is the inexorable social darkness into which the penal system casts its damned. The sea is immense wretchedness. The soul cut adrift in these fathomless depths may become a corpse. Who will resuscitate it? Chapter 9, New Woes. When the time came to leave the prison hulks, when Jean Valjean heard in his ear those strange words, "You're free," it was an improbable and unbelievable moment. A brilliant ray of light, real light, the light of the living, suddenly penetrated him. But it was not long before this ray dimmed. Jean Valjean had been dazzled by the idea of liberty. He had believed in a new life. He very quickly saw what kind of liberty it was to which a yellow passport is given. And with this realization came much bitterness. He had calculated that his earnings during his time in the prison hulks ought to have amounted to 171 francs. It is fair to add that he had forgotten to include in his calculations the compulsory days of rest on Sundays and public holidays, that over 19 years resulted in a reduction of about 24 francs. Be that as it may, his earnings had been reduced by various local levies to the sum of 109 francs, 15 sous, which was counted out to him on his release. He did not understand any of this, and believed he had been wronged. Let us say the word, robbed. The day after he was freed, he saw some men unloading bales outside an orange flower distillery in Grasse. He offered his services. The job needed to be done quickly. He was accepted. He set to work. He was quick-witted, robust, and deft. He gave his best. The foreman seemed pleased. While he was working, a gendarme came by, noticed him, and asked for his papers. He had to show the yellow passport. Jean Valjean then went back to work. A little earlier he had asked one of the workmen what their daily rate for this job was. The reply was 30 sous. Come evening, as he had to be on his way again the following day, he presented himself to the foreman of the distillery and asked to be paid. Without a word, the foreman gave him 25 sous. He protested. It's good enough for you, he was told. He insisted. The foreman looked him straight in the eye and said, "You want to end up back in the clink?" Again, he felt robbed. By reducing his savings, society, the state, had robbed him in a big way. Now it was the turn of the individual to rob him in a small way. Release is not freedom. You are let out of prison, but you continue to serve your sentence. This is what happened to him at Grasse. We have seen what sort of reception he got at Digne. I looked up how to pronounce that, and I still can't say it right. It is so unfathomably bright. Lighting is hard, and I don't own many lights. And, this is still my house. I can't, set up 20 lights just to get this to look great. Every night. Ugh. Reading is hard. Let's go shopping. Anyway, chapter 10. The Man Awakened. So as the cathedral clock struck 2 a.m, Jean Valjean awoke. What wakened him was that his bed was too comfortable. It was nearly 20 years since he had lain in a bed, and although he had not undressed, it was too novel a sensation not to disturb his sleep. He had slept more than 4 hours. His tiredness had passed. He was not used to taking many hours' rest. He opened his eyes and stared for a moment into the darkness around him, then closed them again to go back to sleep. When it has been a hectic day with many varied sensations, when things are on your mind, you fall asleep, but you do not go back to sleep. Sleep comes more easily than it returns. This is what happened to Jean Valjean. He could not get to sleep again, and he fell to thinking. He was at one of those moments when the thoughts in his mind were unclear. There was a kind of indistinct welter in his brain. His old memories and his very recent memories swirled in a jumble and overlapped chaotically, losing their formal identity, becoming disproportionately magnified, then suddenly disappearing altogether, as in disturbed and muddy waters. Many thoughts occurred to him, but there was one that kept coming to the fore and driving out all the others. What that thought was, we shall say at once. He had noticed the 6 sets of silverware and the ladle that Madame Magloire had placed on the table. Those 6 sets of silver preyed on him. They were right there, a few paces away. Just as he was passing through the next room to reach the one where he was now, the old servant had been putting them away in a small cupboard at the head of the bed. He had taken careful note of that cupboard. On the right, as you entered from the dining room, they were solid silver, antique silverware. With the ladle, they would fetch at least 200 francs. Double what he had earned in 19 years. It is true he would have earned more if the authorities hadn't robbed him. He wavered for a whole hour, and there was certainly some element of conflict in his vacillations. 3 o'clock struck. He opened his eyes again, suddenly sat bolt upright, reached out his arm and felt for his knapsack, which he had thrown into the corner of the alcove, then swung his legs over and put his feet on the ground. And so, almost without knowing how, he found himself sitting on the side of his bed. He remained for a while brooding in this position, which might have suggested something sinister to anyone seeing him like this in the dark, the only soul awake in that sleeping household. All at once he bent down, took off his shoes, and quietly placed them on the mat beside the bed. Then he resumed his pensive attitude and once again sat motionless. Throughout these dreadful ruminations, the thoughts we referred to above were in constant ferment in his brain, coming and going and returning again in a way of oppressing him. And then, without knowing why, and with the involuntary obsessiveness of idle fancy, he thought too about a convict named Brevet, whom he had known in the prison hulks, and whose trousers had been held up by a single brace of knitted cotton. The checkered pattern of that brace kept coming back into his mind. He remained in this quandary, and might have remained so indefinitely until daybreak had the clock not struck, the quarter hour or the half hour. It was as if that stroke said to him, "Get on with it." He stood up, hesitated yet a moment, and listened. All was quiet in the house. Then, walking gingerly, he went directly to the window, which he could see. It was not a very dark night. There was a full moon with large clouds driven by the wind coursing across it. This created alternating darkness and light outside, eclipses, then brightnesses, and inside a kind of half-light. This half-light, sufficient for a person to find his way by, and intermittent on account of the clouds, was like that sort of leaden wanness that comes in through a basement window with passers-by coming and going in front of it. When he reached the window, Jean Valjean examined it. There were no bars on it. It opened onto the garden and was simply fastened with a small latch, according to local custom. He opened it, but as a rush of biting cold air came into the room, he immediately shut it again. He observed the garden with that attentive gaze that does not so much look as study. The garden was enclosed by a fairly low white wall, easy to climb. Beyond the wall, at the bottom of the garden, he could discern regularly spaced out treetops, which indicated that the wall separated the garden from a tree-lined avenue or lane. Having taken this quick glance, he shook himself like a man who has made up his mind, strode to the alcove, grabbed his knapsack, opened it, rummaged in it, pulled out something that he placed on the bed, stuffed his shoes into one of the pockets, closed it all up again, shouldered the knapsack, put on his cap, and pulled the peak down over his eyes, felt for his staff, went and placed it in the corner by the window, then returned to the bed and resolutely seized the object he had laid on it. It looked like a short iron bar, sharpened at one end like a spear. It would have been hard to determine in the darkness for what purpose the length of iron could have been designed. Perhaps it was a lever. Perhaps it was a club. In the daytime, it would have been recognized as none other than a miner's candlestick. At the time, convicts were sometimes employed in quarrying stone from the high hills around Toulon, and it was not unusual for them to have miners' tools at their disposal. Miners' candlesticks are of solid iron, with the lower end tapering to a point by means of which they are jammed into the rock. He took this candlestick in his right hand and, holding his breath and softening his footsteps, made for the door to the adjoining room, the bishop's room, as we know. When he reached this door, he found it ajar. The bishop had not closed it. Quick drink of water. We'll keep on going. Chapter 11. What he does. Jean Valjean listened. Not a sound. He pushed the door. He pushed it gently with his finger, with that furtive and circumspect delicacy of a cat that wants to come in. The door yielded to the pressure with a scarcely perceptible and silent movement which enlarged the opening a little. He waited a moment, then pushed the door a second time, more boldly. It continued to yield in silence. The opening was now wide enough for him to get through, but there was a little table near the door, at an awkward angle to it, barring the way. Jean Valjean saw the difficulty. It was absolutely imperative for the opening to be made even wider. He steeled himself and pushed the door a third time, more energetically than before. This time a hinge that needed oiling emitted a sudden, lengthy screech in the darkness. Jean Valjean quailed. The noise of that hinge rang in his ear with something of the tremendous stridency of the trumpet of the day of judgment. In his fanciful exaggerations of that first instant, he almost imagined the hinge had become animate and all at once acquired a dreadful life force, and that it was barking like a dog to alert everyone and waken those who were asleep. He paused, trembling, panic-stricken, and from tiptoe dropped flat on his feet. He heard the arteries in his temples thudding like two sledgehammers, and the breath expelled from his chest sounded to him like wind issuing from a cave. He thought it impossible that the horrible din of that grating hinge would not have disturbed the whole household, like an earthquake tremor. The door he had pushed had taken fright and called out. The old man was going to get up. The two old women were going to cry for help. People would come running. Within a quarter of an hour, the town would be in an uproar, and the gendarmerie mobilized. For a moment, he thought he was doomed. My alarm just went off to tell me, hey, get ready for Hot Dad Reads. And, ha-ha, Rowdy here. Alarm. He stood where he was, petrified, like the statue of salt, not daring to move. Several minutes went by. The door was now wide open. He ventured to peer into the room. Nothing had stirred. He listened. All was still in the house. The noise of the rusty hinge had not wakened anyone. The first danger was past, but there was still a frightful tumult inside him. Yet he did not retreat. Even when he thought he was doomed, he had not retreated. His one concern now was to get it over with quickly. He took a step forward and entered the room. In this room, there was perfect calm. Discernible here and there were ill-defined, vague forms that, in daylight, were papers scattered on a table, open folios, volumes piled on a stool, an armchair heaped with clothing, a kneeler. But at that hour were no more than shadowy corners and pale patches. Jean Valjean advanced cautiously, taking care not to bump into the furniture. He could hear at the far end of the room the sleeping bishop's calm and regular breathing. He came to a sudden halt. He was by the bed. He had reached it sooner than he expected. Nature sometimes marries her dramatic effects and visual displays to our actions with a kind of somber, intelligent appropriateness, as if wanting to make us think. For nearly half an hour, a large cloud had covered the sky. At the very moment that Jean Valjean paused at the foot of the bed, that cloud parted as though on purpose, and a shaft of moonlight shining through the long window suddenly illuminated the bishop's pale face. He was sleeping peacefully. Because of the cold nights in the Basses Alps, he was in bed almost fully clothed, in a brown woolen garment that covered his arms to the wrists. His head rested on the pillow in the abandon of sleep. His hand, on which he wore the pastoral ring, a hand that was the author of so many good deeds and saintly acts, was left dangling over the side of the bed. His whole face was lit up with an indefinable expression of satisfaction, hope, and bliss. More than a smile, it was almost a radiance. There was on his brow the mystical reflection of an unseen light. In sleep, the souls of the just contemplate a mysterious heaven. A reflection of that heaven fell on the bishop. It was at the same time a luminous transparency, for that heaven was within him. That heaven was his conscience. When the moonbeam superimposed itself, so to speak, on that inward radiance, the sleeping bishop appeared as if in glory. Yet it was a vision that remained soft and veiled in an ineffable half-light. That moon in the sky, that hush upon nature, that undisturbed garden, and that great peacefulness in the house, the hour, the moment, the silence, added some solemn and inexpressible quality to this sage's venerable repose, and surrounded with a kind of serene and majestic aureole that white hair and those closed eyes, that face in which all was hope and all was trustfulness, that old man's head in childlike sleep. There was almost something divine about this man and his unconscious awesomeness. Jean Valjean, meanwhile, was in shadow, standing motionless with his iron candlestick in his hand, terrified of this radiant elder. He had never seen anything like it. This trustfulness appalled him. The moral world has no greater spectacle than this, a troubled and uneasy conscience on the brink of an evil action, contemplating the sleep of a good man. There was in that sleep, in that separateness, with one such as he nearby, an element of the sublime in which he was vaguely but compellingly aware. No one could have said what was going on inside him, but not even he himself. To try to conceive it, we have to imagine that which is most violent in the presence of that which is most gentle. Even on his face nothing could be discerned with certainty. It was a sort of haggard amazement. He saw. That was all. But what was he thinking? It was impossible to tell. What was obvious was that he was emotionally affected and confused. But what was the nature of his emotion? He did not take his eyes off the old man. The only thing clearly evident from his attitude and the expression on his face was a strange indecision. He seemed to be hovering between two abysses, that of perdition and that of salvation. He looked as if he were about to crush that skull or kiss that hand. After a few moments his left arm rose slowly to his brow, and he took off his cap. Then just as slowly his arm fell again, and Jean Valjean resumed his contemplation, with his cap in his left hand, his candlestick in his right, the hair on his feral head bristling. The bishop slept on in profound peacefulness beneath that terrifying gaze. A reflection of the moon picked out faintly above the fireplace the crucifix, which seemed to open its arms to both of them, with a blessing for one, forgiveness for the other. Jean Valjean abruptly replaced his cap on his head. Then, without looking at the bishop, walked rapidly past the bed straight to the cupboard. He saw, indistinctly, standing by the head of it. He raised his iron candlestick as though to force the lock. The key was in it. He opened the cupboard. The first thing that met his eyes was the basket of silverware. He took it, and throwing caution to the wind, strode across the room, not worrying about the noise, reached the door, re-entered the chapel, opened the window, seized his staff, climbed over the ground floor windowsill, put the silver into his knapsack, threw away the basket, crossed the garden, leapt over the wall like a tiger, and fled. That guy took the silver, took his flight, in the words of Colm Wilkinson. Who keeps texting me? Hey, we're almost at the halfway point. Because we're doing 2 hours today. I kind of like doing the stream at 9 instead of 10. Like, this might work out. I don't know. And also, I have a lot of book to read. And we've got an operetta coming up. So rehearse for that. I'm not going to be there every day. I better not be there every day. But, I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen schedule-wise with the stream during that. And that'll probably be, a little bit of August, September, October, and then we're running. So I get some time in between. So I'm thinking about doing more 2-hour streams. I'm also thinking during the school year of pulling in Andy Kaufman and attempting to read The Great Gatsby in one sitting. I should definitely wait until I'm not doing a play, because I imagine that might destroy my voice. Why does The Witcher keep texting me? And by texting, I mean, why does the TV show The Witcher keep sending me tweets? That's funny. All right, chapter 12, The Bishop at Work. Oh, by the way, patreon.com/hotdadreads. I should really, put that text somewhere. I have this whole window, and I like the look of the books, but I don't know. Just right across my chest on the stream. Just, hey, subscribe. We have several levels. We do the super secret Saturday Shakespeare stream. It's a lot of fun. All the levels, the higher levels get everything in the lower levels, all that stuff. So, really all I care about is the Saturday Shakespeare stream. If you want more, if you want access to fun videos, or all of the prior books that we've read, if you want the top stream, the top subscription level is I'll read something that you write. You have a book, or novel, a song, a poem, a play, as long as it's not horribly, horribly racist, even a little racist, let's face it. Yeah, I'll read it. It'll be fun. But, check all that out. Patreon.com/ahotdadreads. Anyway, chapter 12, The Bishop at Work. The next day at sunrise, Monseigneur Bienvenu was strolling in his garden. Madame Magloire came running up to him in a frenzy. "Monseigneur, Monseigneur," she exclaimed, "does your highness know where the silverware basket is?" "Yes," replied the bishop. "Blessed be the Lord Jesus," she said. "I didn't know what had become of it." The bishop had just found the basket in a flower bed. He handed it to Madame Magloire. "Here it is." "Well," she said, "it's empty. What about the silverware?" "Ah," replied the bishop. "So it's the silverware you're worried about. I don't know where that is." "Good Lord Almighty, it's been stolen. The man who was here last night has stolen it." In a twinkling, with all that spirited old girl's spryness, Madame Magloire ran to the chapel, entered the alcove, and returned to the bishop. The bishop had just bent down and was woefully examining a plant, a Guion cochlearia, which the basket had damaged as it fell into the flower bed. He straightened up at Madame Magloire's cry. "Monseigneur, the man's gone! The silver's been stolen!" As she uttered this explanation, her eyes fell on a corner of the garden where there were signs of the wall having been climbed. The coping was damaged. "Look! That's how he got out. He jumped down into Rue Cochefilet. Oh, the wicked fellow! He's stolen our silver!" The bishop remained silent for a moment, then raised his solemn gaze and said quietly to Madame Magloire, "Now, was that silver ours in the first place?" Madame Magloire was left speechless. There was another silence. Then the bishop went on. "Madame Magloire, I've been wrongfully keeping that silver for a long time. It belonged to the poor. And what was that man? Obviously, one of the poor." "Dear Jesus," said Madame Magloire, "it's not for me or Mademoiselle. It makes no difference to us, but it's for Monseigneur. What's Monseigneur to eat with now?" The bishop gazed at her with an expression of amazement. "Oh, come now, haven't we some pewter cutlery?" Madame Magloire shrugged. "Pewter has a smell." "It does have a smell." What are we doing? I'm having a sense memory right now. That's it. Yeah, when we did Camelot in high school, and I got to play King Arthur, pile of fun. We had pewter goblets, because if you're gonna have a goblet, if you're gonna go sailing, it's gonna be made out of pewter. I think my grandmother has pewter goblets. It's possible that they were my grandmother's pewter goblets. I don't remember. But anyway, we had these goblets, and I just remember they're full of water, and we're all like, "Ha-ha, let us make an accord, and let us have a covenant between us, blah, 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 drinking water, pretending it's wine, being high schoolers, what have you. But yeah, the distinct smell of cold water and pewter is kind of the best. Like, it's not a good smell, but it's like I don't know, maybe it's because I'm associating with happy memories. And, memories I haven't thought about in almost 20 years. So, yeah. Tin cutlery, then. Madame Magloire gave a meaningful grimace. "Tin leaves a taste in your mouth." "Very well," said the bishop. "Wooden cutlery." A few moments later, he was having breakfast at the very table where Jean Valjean had sat the previous evening. As he breakfasted, Monseigneur Bienvenu remarked cheerfully to his sister, who said nothing, and to Madame Magloire, who muttered to herself that there was absolutely no need even for a wooden fork or spoon to dip a piece of bread in a cup of milk. "Really, the very idea," Madame Magloire was saying as she bustled about, "of allowing a man like that into your house and letting him stay the night with you. It's lucky all he did was steal. Lord, it makes you shudder to think of it." As brother and sister were about to leave the table, there was a knock at the door. "Come in," said the bishop. The door opened. An extraordinary, violent group appeared on the threshold. 3 men were holding a fourth by the scruff of his neck. The 3 men were gendarmes. The other was Jean Valjean. A sergeant of the gendarmerie, who seemed to be in command of the group, stood close to the door. He entered and approached the bishop, giving a military salute. I'm not worried about voices for this, but everyone's gruff. "Monseigneur," he said. At this word, Jean Valjean, glum and dejected looking, lifted his head in amazement. "Monseigneur," he murmured. "So he's not the parish priest." "Silence," said the gendarme. This is Monseigneur the Bishop. In the meantime, Monseigneur Bienvenu had stepped forward as quickly as his great age allowed. "Ah, there you are," he exclaimed, looking at Jean Valjean. "I'm glad to see you. Now look here. I gave you those candlesticks as well. They're silver like the rest, and you'll certainly be able to get 200 francs for them. Why didn't you take them with your forks and spoons?" Jean Valjean's eyes widened, and he stared at the venerable bishop with an expression no human tongue can describe. "Monseigneur," said the sergeant, "what this man said is true, then? We ran into him. He looked like someone leaving town. We stopped to see him. He had this silver, and you told him," the bishop broke in with a smile, "that it was given to him by an old buffer of a priest in whose house he'd spent the night? I see the situation. And you brought him back here. There's been a misunderstanding." "You mean we can let him go?" said the sergeant. "Undoubtedly," said the bishop. The gendarmes released Jean Valjean, who backed away. "Is it true they're letting me go?" he said, in an almost inarticulate voice, and as if he were talking in his sleep. "Yes, we're letting you go, didn't you hear?" said one of the gendarmes. "My friend," said the bishop, "before you go, here are your candlesticks. Take them." He went over to the fireplace, took the 2 silver candlesticks, and brought them to Jean Valjean. The 2 women watched him without a word, without making a move, without a glance that might upset the bishop. Jean Valjean trembled in every limb. He took the 2 candlesticks automatically, looking bewildered. "Now," said the bishop, "go in peace. By the way, if ever you come back, my friend, there's no need to pass through the garden. You can always enter and leave by the street door. It's left on the latch, day and night." Then turning to the gendarmes, he said, "You may go, gentlemen." The gendarmes left. Jean Valjean was like a man about to faint. The bishop went up to him and said quietly, "Don't forget. Never forget. You promised to use this money to become an honest man." Jean Valjean, who had no recollection of having made any promise, remained dumbfounded. The bishop had dwelled on these words as he said them. He went on with a kind of solemnity. "Jean Valjean, my brother, you are no longer owned by evil but by good. It's your soul I'm buying. I'm redeeming it from dark thoughts and the spirit of perdition, and I'm giving it to God." Water break. What have I done? Sweet Jesus, what have I done? Big old stretch. Went with a burp. Reading for 2 hours straight is it's a lot of fun, I have to say. And lately, for the past 2 weeks, my voice has been exactly where I want it to be, and it's really, really nice. So I've been like, cool, I'm finally at a place where I really like where I'm at. So I'm keeping track of like, what do foods do to my voice? What is good for it? What's bad for it? And this is probably going to be terrible for singing, but at least for speaking. Cold Coca-Cola in an aluminum can. It's so good. It just like oils everything. I don't know. Cold water, you know. I know like singing wise, you want to get everything nice and loose. So you want like warm water, tea, all that stuff. steam, all these things to kind of like, well, steam more so, less than it's gonna, you kind of want to inhale that to like hydrate. That's the word. Doesn't take very long to do that, but just remaining hydrated, drinking lots of water, really good for the voice. For the skin, for the hair, it's good for everything. Chapter 13, Petit Gervais. Jean Valjean left the town as though he were escaping. He set off through the countryside, walking as fast as he could, following the roads and paths that appeared in front of him, without noticing that he kept retracing his steps. He wandered about like this all morning, without having eaten and without feeling hungry. He was prey to a host of new sensations. He felt a kind of rage. He knew not against whom. He would have been unable to say whether he felt touched or humiliated. He was overcome at times with an unfamiliar susceptibility to emotion which he fought against, resisting it with the hardening of his heart over the last 20 years. Being in this state tired him. He saw with dismay the disintegration within him of that sort of appalling calm that the injustice of his misfortune had bestowed on him. He wondered what would replace it. At times he truly would have preferred to be in prison with the gendarmes, and for things not to have turned out like this. It would have been less disturbing. Although the season was fairly far advanced, here and there in the hedgerows were still a few late flowers, whose scent, as he walked past them, brought back childhood memories. Pardon me. It was so long since he was last visited by them that these memories were almost unbearable. Inexpressible thoughts gathered inside him like this, all day long. As the sun set in the evening, casting a long shadow on the ground, even from the smallest pebble, Jean Valjean was sitting behind a bush on a vast russet plain that was absolutely deserted. There was nothing on the horizon except the Alps, not even the spire of a distant village. Jean Valjean was probably some 9 miles from Digne. A path that cut across the plain passed within a few paces of the bush. In the midst of these reflections, that would have contributed in no small way to making his raggedness look terrifying to anyone who might have encountered him, he heard a joyful sound. He looked round and saw, coming along the path, a little Savoyard, about 10 years old, singing, with his hurdy-gurdy at his side and his marmot cage on his back. One of those sweet, blithe little lads who go from place to place, with their knees showing through the holes in their trousers. I always pronounce it Savoyard. It could be Savoyard or Savoyard, But, it's of the Savoy. So if you're of the Savoy, you're a Savoyard. A Savoyard. Savoyard feels weird. The Savoy. The Savoyard. The Savoy. The Savoy. I don't know. Said it too many times. Hand, gone. Singing all the while, the young lad interrupted his progress from time to time to play knucklebones with a few small coins he had in his hand, probably his entire fortune. This small change included 1 40-sou piece. The child drew up beside the bush without noticing Jean Valjean and tossed up his handful of coins, all of which he had until then caught quite deftly on the back of his hand. This time, the 40-sou piece escaped him and went rolling into the undergrowth till it reached Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean put his foot over it. The child, meanwhile, had been watching where his coin went and saw this. Unabashed, he walked straight up to the man. It was a totally isolated spot. As far as the eye could see, there was no one, either on the plain or on the path. The only sound to be heard were the faint little cries of a flock of migratory birds flying through the sky at an immense height. The child stood with his back to the sun, which threaded his hair with gold, and with a blood-red glow dyed crimson the savage face of Jean Valjean. "Monsieur, my coin?" said the little Savoyard with that childish trustfulness that is a blend of ignorance and innocence. "What's your name?" said Jean Valjean. "Petit Gervais, monsieur." "Go away," said Jean Valjean. "Monsieur," said the child, "give me back my coin." Jean Valjean lowered his head and said nothing. The child repeated, "My coin, monsieur?" Jean Valjean's eyes remained fixed on the ground. "My coin!" cried the child. "My silver coin! My money!" Jean Valjean seemed not to hear. The child grasped him by the collar of his shirt and shook him, and at the same time he did his utmost to shift the big hobnailed shoe standing on his treasure. "I want my coin, my 40-sou coin!" The child wept. Jean Valjean lifted his head. He was still seated. He was bleary-eyed. He observed the child with a kind of amazement. Then he reached for his staff and cried in a terrible voice, "Who is it?" "Me, monsieur," replied the child. "Petit Gervais, me, please give me back my 40 sous. Please move your foot, monsieur." Then, though very small, annoyed, and becoming almost threatening, "I say, will you move your foot? Go on, move your foot, will you? Will you go to lunch?" "Ah, you again," said Jean Valjean, and suddenly rising to his full height, with his foot still covering the silver coin, he added, "Get lost, will you?" The terrified child stared at him, then began to tremble from head to foot, and after a few seconds of stupefied paralysis, took to his heels, running away as fast as his legs could carry him, not daring to look back or to cry out. However, some way off he was forced to stop for want of breath, and in his distractedness, Jean Valjean heard the child sobbing. A few moments later, the child had vanished. The sun had set. Darkness gathered round Jean Valjean. He had eaten nothing all day. He was probably feverish. He remained standing, his position unchanged since the child fled. At long and irregular intervals his chest rose with his indrawn breath. His gaze, focused 10 or 12 paces in front of him, seemed to be studying intently the shape of an old blue earthenware shard lying in the grass. All at once he shuddered, suddenly aware of the evening chill. He settled his cap more firmly on his brow, unconsciously pulled his shirt closed and buttoned it up, took a step forward, and bent down to pick up his staff. At that moment he caught sight of the 40-sou coin, which his foot had half buried in the ground, glinting among the stones. The effect was seismic. "What's that?" he said to himself. He fell back 3 paces, then stopped, unable to tear his gaze from that spot his foot had been trampling a moment before, as though the thing gleaming there in the dusk were an eye riveted on him. After a few moments he darted towards the silver coin, seized it, and straightening up again began to gaze into the distance across the plain, looking towards the horizon in every direction, standing there quivering like a frightened wild animal seeking a refuge. He saw nothing. Darkness was falling. The plain was cold and indistinct. Great purple mists were rising in the twilight glow. "Ah," he said, and struck out rapidly in a certain direction, the one taken by the child when he disappeared. After about 30 paces he paused, looked about him, and saw nothing. Then he shouted with all his might, "Petit Gervais! Petit Gervais!" He fell silent and waited. There was no reply. The landscape was bleak and deserted. He was surrounded by unbounded space. There was nothing around him but a shadowy darkness in which his gaze was lost, and a silence in which his voice was lost. An icy north wind blew and gave a sort of lugubrious vitality to things around him. The bushes flailed their skinny little limbs with incredible fury. They looked threatening, as if they were pursuing someone. He set off again, walking, then began to run, and from time to time he stopped and shouted into that solitude in the most rending and most disconsolate voice ever to be heard, "Petit Gervais! Petit Gervais!" If the child had heard it, he would surely have been frightened and have taken good care not to show himself. But the child was no doubt already far away. He met a priest on horseback. He went up to him and said, "Monsieur le Curé, have you seen a child go by?" "No," said the priest. "One by the name of Petit Gervais?" "I have not seen anyone." He drew 2 5-franc pieces from his purse and handed them to the priest. "Monsieur le Curé, take this for your poor. Monsieur le Curé, he's a little lad, about 10 years old, with a marmot, I think, and a hurdy-gurdy, one of those wandering Savoyards, you know." "I haven't seen him." "Petit Gervais? He's not from one of the villages hereabouts, can you tell me?" From what you say, my friend, the child's a little stranger. They pass through. We don't know him." Jean Valjean seized another 5-franc coins and thrust them at the priest. "For your poor," he said. Then he added wildly, "Monsieur l'Abbé, have me arrested. I'm a thief." The priest dug in his spurs and rode off very scared. Jean Valjean started running again in the direction he had first taken. And so he went on for quite a long way, looking round, calling, shouting, but he met no one. 2 or 3 times he ran across the plain towards something that looked like a person lying down or crouching, but turned out to be just low-lying shrubs or rocks. Eventually, at a place where 3 paths met, he came to a halt. The moon had risen. He peered into the distance and called out one last time, "Petit Gervais! Petit Gervais!" His cry died in the mist without even raising an echo. He murmured again, but in a faint and almost inarticulate voice, "Petit Gervais." That was his final effort. His legs suddenly gave way beneath him, as though all at once some invisible power had crushed him with the weight of his own bad conscience. He collapsed on a large stone, exhausted, with his hands in his hair and his face in his lap, and he cried, "I'm a wretch." Then his heart burst. Sorry, kitty. And he began to weep. It was the first time he had wept in 19 years. When Jean Valjean left the bishop's house, he was, as we have seen, in what was to him an entirely different mental universe. He could not understand what was going on inside him. He hardened himself against the old man's angelic deed and gentle words. You promised to become an honest man. Wrong voice. You promised to become an honest man. I'm buying your soul. I'm redeeming it from the spirit of iniquity and giving it to the good Lord. This kept coming back to him. This heavenly kindness he centered with pride, the fortress of evil, as it were, within us. He countered with pride. He had the indistinct feeling that this priest's forgiveness was the greatest assault and most tremendous attack he had ever experienced. That if he resisted this clemency, the hardening of his heart would be definitive. That if he yielded, he would be obliged to renounce that hatred with which the deeds of other men had filled his soul over so many years, a hatred he relished. That this time he had to vanquish or be vanquished, and that the battle had been joined, a colossal and decisive battle between his own wickedness and that man's goodness. Among all these glimmers of understanding, he reeled like a drunken man. As he walked on, wild-eyed, had he any clear perception of what his experience in D-Day might lead to? Did he hear all those mysterious murmurs that caution or badger the spirit at certain moments in life? Did a voice whisper in his ear that what he had just lived through was the key moment of his existence? For him, there was no middle ground anymore. After this, if he were not to be the best of men, he would be the worst. To put it another way, he would now have to rise higher than the bishop or fall lower than the convict. If he wished to become good, he would have to be an angel. If he wished to remain wicked, he would have to be a monster. Here again, those questions need to be asked that we have already raised elsewhere. Did he, amid the confusion of his thoughts, have any inkling of all this? Certainly, as we have said, understanding is schooled by adversity. However, it is doubtful that Jean Valjean was capable of unraveling all that we are suggesting. If these ideas occurred to him, he glimpsed rather than saw them, and they succeeded only in casting him into a state of unbearable and almost painful perplexity. As too bright a light would have hurt his eyes on emerging from the dark, so the bishop hurt his soul when he came out of that perverse place of darkness called penal servitude. The future life, the potential life, now offered to him filled him with trepidation and anxiety. He did not really know where he was anymore. Like an owl that might suddenly see the sun rise, the convict had been dazzled and, so to speak, blinded by virtue. What was certain, what he was sure of, was that he was no longer the same man. He was completely changed within. It was no longer in his power to act as though the bishop had not spoken to him, had not touched him. In this state of mind, he had encountered Petit Gervais and robbed him of his 40 sous. Why? He could certainly not have explained it. Was it a lingering effect and a final exertion, as it were, of the evil thoughts he had brought with him from prison? A residual impulse, the result of what in statics is called momentum? It was that, and it was also perhaps not even so much as that. Let us put it in simpler terms. It was not he who stole. It was not the man. It was the beast that, out of habit and instinct, had stupidly put his foot on that money while the thinking mind was grappling with so many new and unprecedented obsessions. When the thinking mind came to its senses again, and saw what the brute had done, Jean Valjean recoiled in anguish and uttered a cry of horror. This was because by stealing money from that child, he had done something of which he was no longer capable. A strange phenomenon that was possible only in his present situation. Be that as it may, this last bad deed had a decisive effect on him. It cut through the chaos in his mind and dispersed it, setting the dark impenetrabilities on one side and light on the other, and it acted on his soul in the state it was then as certain chemical agents act on a cloudy solution by precipitating one element and clarifying the other. First of all, even before any self-searching or reflection, in a panic, like someone trying to run away, he did his utmost to find the child to give him back his money. Then, when he realized this was futile, impossible, he halted in despair. The moment when he cried out, "I'm a wretch," he had just seen himself for what he was. And already he was so divorced from himself that he felt that he was no more than a ghost, and that standing there before him in flesh and blood, with that shirt on his back, with his staff in his hand, with the knapsack he was carrying packed with stolen objects, with his face grim and determined, and his mind filled with heinous plans, was the ghastly convicted felon, Jean Valjean. Overwhelming conviction, as we have noted, had made him something of a visionary. This, then, was in the nature of a vision. He actually saw this Jean Valjean, this sinister face before him. He was almost starting to wonder who the man was, and was horrified by him. His brain was experiencing one of those turbulent and yet dreadfully calm moments when introspection is so profound that it absorbs reality. You no longer see the objects around you, and you see the images in your mind as if they were outside yourself. So he beheld himself, as it were, face to face, and at the same time he saw in mysterious depth beyond this hallucination a kind of light, which he initially took for a blazing torch. Looking more closely at this light that appeared to his conscience, he realized it had a human form, and that this torch was the bishop. His conscience considered in turn each of the two men placed before it, the bishop and Jean Valjean. It took no less a person than the former to be the undoing of the latter. By one of those singular effects peculiar to transports of this kind, as his trance-like delirium continued, in his eyes the bishop grew in stature and brilliance, while Jean Valjean shrank and faded. There came a point when he was no more than a shadow. All of a sudden he vanished. The bishop alone remained. He filled this wretched man's entire soul with a magnificent radiance. Jean Valjean wept for a long time. He wept burning tears. He sobbed, more defenseless than a woman, more frightened than a child. As he wept, his mind was flooded with light, an extraordinary light, a light at once ravishing and terrible. His past life, his first misdeed, his long expiation, his outward brutalization, his inward hardening, his release celebrated with so many plans of vengeance, what had happened to him at the bishop's house, the latest thing he had done, stealing 40 sous from a child, a crime all the more craven and all the more monstrous, coming after the bishop's pardon. All this came back to him. He saw it clearly, and with a clarity such as he had never seen before. He beheld his life, and it looked horrible. He beheld his soul, and it looked dreadful. Yet this life and this soul were bathed in a gentle light. He thought he saw Satan by the light of paradise. How long did he weep like this? What did he do after he had wept? Where did he go? This was never known. One thing only seems to have been established. That same night, the coach driver who did the Grenoble post run in those days and arrived in Dinan about 3 o'clock in the morning, as he came down the street where the bishop lived, saw a man who looked as if he was praying, kneeling on the ground in the darkness at Monseigneur Bienvenu's front door. Hey, we finished book 2. It's 10:30. We got time for more. My hand. This book is so heavy. And I've broken my wrists 5 times and this finger over a year ago. And I don't know what a good solution looks like. Big old reader stand that like slides sideways over here. Covers up most of the stream. In reading this book and had the ring light just perpetually in this corner of my eye. When I close my eyes, I can still see it. I can still see the burning ring of fire, even with my closed eyes. I see it in my waking eyes. That's all. All streamers are Frodo. That's the new rule. Book 3, in the year 1817. Chapter 1, the year 1817. Neat. I don't quite know how royalty and lineage work. I think that it skips around sometime, but I just watched the History Buffs episode about Man in the Iron Mask. They were talking about Louis XIV. But this is talking about Louis XVIII. It's like, oh, it's only like 4 generations away. You got Musketeers, you got like, well, that was like 1662 when that story happened. And this is 1817, so like 150 years, basically. Is that 4 generations? Yeah, that could be 4 generations. Especially royal generations. I don't know, man. There were guillotines everywhere. 1817 is the year that Louis XVIII described, with a royal self-assurance not lacking in pride, as the 22nd of his reign. It is the year when Monsieur Bruyère de Sorsum was famous. All the wig-makers' shops, hoping that the royal bird style of powdered wig would make a comeback, were painted blue with the fleur-de-lis. It was the time when, as church warden, Comte Lynch sat in the front pew at Saint-Germain-des-Prés every Sunday, wearing the robes of the French peerage, with his Legion of Honor and his long nose, and that majesty of profile characteristic of a man who has performed a brilliant deed. By the way, I don't speak French. I apologize. The brilliant deed performed by Monsieur Lynch was this. Having, as Mayor of Bordeaux, on the 12th of March, 1814, surrendered the city a little too promptly to Monsieur de Luc d'Angoulême. Hence, his peerage. You know what? That's the new rule. This isn't really a drinking stream. I'd say every time I butcher the French, take a drink, but then we'd all die. Plus, like, it's wash a dish. That's what it is. Do some push-ups. Wash a dish. I don't know. You might be trying to take a nap while you watch this. Roll over, do something fun. In 1817, it was the fashion for little boys of between 4 and 6 years of age to be enveloped in huge Morocco leather caps with ear flaps, quite similar to Eskimo headwear. The French army was dressed in white. Austrian-style regiments were called legions, and instead of numbers, they bore the names of départements. Napoleon was on St. Helena, and as England refused to provide him with green cloth, he was having his old coats turned. In 1817, Pellegrini sang. Mademoiselle Bigottini danced. Potier ruled the stage. Audrey did not yet exist. Madame Saqui was stepping into the shoes of Furioso. There were still Prussians in France. Monsieur Delalot was a prominent figure. Legitimacy had recently asserted itself by cutting off the hand, then the head of Plegnier, Carbonneau, and Tolleron. Grand Chamberlain Prince de Talleyrand and Minister of Finance designate Abbé Louis laughed like two soothsayers catching each other's eye. On the 14th of July, 1790, both of them had celebrated Mass in the Champ de Mars for the Feast of the Federation. Talleyrand officiating as bishop and Louis serving as deacon. I don't know the difference between Louis, Lois, and Louis. I have no idea. In 1817, in the side avenues of this same Champ de Mars, great wooden pillars, painted blue with traces of gilded eagles and bees on them, were to be seen lying in the rain, rotting in the grass. These were the columns that 2 years earlier had supported the emperor's dais in the Champ de Mai. This is the... Okay. 1, 2, 3.5 pages of one paragraph. Whew. Whew. I hope we have enough time. They were blackened in places, scorched by the campfires of the Austrians bivouacked near the Gros Caillou district of Paris. Caillou! I understand that kid's an asshole. Also, it's fun, 1817, because this was about 100 years before World War I. And so there were, historians would often wonder, at this period, 1817 and whatnot, what did the French military look like? They'd have these descriptions, as it says, they wore white. It's what did that look like? How did that work? The thing is, the French military outfit didn't change until it was affected by World War I. When World War I began, they have photographs, because the outfit was the same for 100 years. And everyone began that war thinking they were going to fight it the same way they'd been fighting wars for the last couple 100 years. Everyone lined up. Horses, not trenches and bunkers and whatnot, just everyone lined up with artillery and the occasional machine gun, the Maxim gun, and 100,000 people would die in a battle. World War I was, oh boy. The beginning of it, there was so much death, there was so much casualty that everyone was just in shock of wait, we've become how deadly? So then it changed into the World War I that we now see and romanticize. The point of all that is to say, if you look at a picture of, I was supposed to say a Corsair, I forget, but the French military at the beginning of World War I, that's what they looked like right now in this book. 2 or 3 of these columns had disappeared in their campfires and warmed the Kaiserlich's big hands. Oh, that's what it'll be. Every time I go on a weird, hot dad ramble, drink. Juice. The remarkable thing about the Champ de Mai was that it was held in the month of June in the Champ de Mars. In the year 1817, 2 things were popular. The Touquet? The Touquet edition of Voltaire, and the charter-engraved snuff box. The latest sensation in Paris was the murder committed by Dauphine, who had thrown his brother's head into the fountain at the Marche aux Fleurs. The Ministry of Naval Affairs had opened an investigation into the doomed frigate Medusa, which was to cover Chamarai with shame and Géricault with glory. Colonel Selves went to Egypt, there to become Suleiman Pasha. The Palais de Thème in Rue de la Harpe was used as a cooper's shop. The little wooden cabin that had served Messier, the naval astronomer under Louis XVI, as an observatory, could still be seen on the flat roof of the Hôtel de Cluny's octagonal tower. In her boudoir, furnished with sky-blue satin stools, the Duchess de Duras, the Duras sisters from Star Trek, the Duchess de Duras read to 3 or 4 friends her unpublished Eurica. The N's were scraped off the Louvre. I guess it was called the Louvre at some point. The Pont d'Austerlitz abdicated and took the name Pont de Jardin de Roi, a twofold riddle, disguising both the Pont d'Austerlitz and the Jardin des Plantes, bringing to his close reading of Horace a particular interest in heroes who become emperors and clogmakers who become dauphins. Louis XVIII had 2 causes for concern: Napoleon and Mathurin Bruneau. The French Academy set as the subject for its prize competition the happiness to be attained through study. Monsieur Bellart was professionally eloquent. Seen preparing to follow in his footsteps was Advocate General to be de Broglie, destined to be lampooned by Paul Louis Courier. There was a pseudo-Chateaubriand named Marchangy, anticipating a pseudo-Marchangy named Darlincourt. Claire d'Albe and Malacadel were literary masterpieces. See, this is why I said don't drink when I butcher the French, because... Good Lord. And Madame Cottin was declared the leading writer of the age. The Institute allowed the academician allowed the academician Napoleon Bonaparte to be struck off its lists of members. A royal decree established Angoulême as the site of a naval academy, for which the Duc d'Angoulême, being Grand Admiral, obviously the city of Angoulême was entitled as a matter of course to all the distinctions of a seaport. Otherwise, the monarchic principle would have been undermined. The question was raised in the Council of Ministers whether the vignettes of acrobatics that adorned Franconi's advertising posters and attracted throngs of street urchins should be tolerated. Monsieur Père, author of Agnes, a fellow with a square face and a wart on his cheek, directed the Marquis de Sassenet's small private concerts in Rue de la Ville-l'Évêque. All young girls sang Le Mythe de Saint-Aville, words by Edmond Giraud. Le Nain Jean became Le Miroir. The Café Lemblin favored the emperor as opposed to the Café Vallot, which favored the Bourbons. Already watched from the shadows by Louvel, the Duc de Berry had just been married to a princess of Sicily. It had been a year since Madame de Staël died. Mademoiselle Mars was booed by members of the Royal Guard. Newspapers of substance were all very lightweight. Newspapers of substance were all very lightweight. Their format was small, but they had great freedom of expression. Le Constitutionnel was constitutional. La Minerve called Chateaubriand. Devastating. That prompted much laughter among the bourgeoisie at the expense of the great writer. In suborned newspapers, time-serving journalists jeered at those exiled in 1815. David was now devoid of talent, Arnaud of wit, Carnot of integrity. Soult had not won a single battle. It is true that Napoleon had lost his military genius. Everybody knows that letters sent to an exile through the post rarely reach their destination, with the police making it their sacred duty to intercept them. This is nothing new. Descartes complained of it during his banishment. Now, when David in a Belgian newspaper expressed some vexation at not having received letters that had been written to him, this was seen as cause for amusement by the royalist rags, which took the opportunity to mock the exile. Whether one said regicides or voters, enemies or allies, Napoleon or Bonaparte, this could divide two men more than any abyss. All right-minded people agreed that King Louis XVIII, hailed as the immortal author of the Charter, had put an end forever to the era of revolutions. In the open space on the Pont Neuf, the word Redivivus was carved on the pedestal awaiting the statue of Henri IV. At 4 Rue Therese, Monsieur Piet, Admiral Piet, if Darth Vader has anything to say about it, Monsieur Piet launched his secret conclave dedicated to consolidating the monarchy. In moments of crisis, the leaders of the right would say, "We must write to Bacot, Messieurs Canot, O'Mahony, and de Chapdelaine were devising, not without the approval of Monsieur, what was later to become the Riverside Conspiracy. The Black Pin had a conspiracy of its own. De la Varderie made contact with Trogoff. Monsieur Decazes, who was something of a liberal, held sway. At 27 Rue Saint-Dominique, Chateaubriand stood at his window every morning in leggings and slippers, his grey hair and a Madras headscarf, staring into a mirror, and with a complete set of dentist's instruments laid out before him, cleaning his splendid teeth, while dictating to his secretary, Monsieur Pilot, drafts of The Monarchy According to the Charter. Oh my God, The Monarchy According to the Charter. Charter. Chowder. Say it right, it's chowder. The leading critics rated Lafon above Talma. Monsieur de Felitz signed himself A. Monsieur Hoffman signed himself Z. Charles Nodier wrote Therese Aubert. Divorce was abolished. The lycées were called colleges. College students, their collars trimmed with a gold fleur-de-lis, came to blows over the King of Rome. The palace's police spies reported to Her Royal Highness, Madame, the ubiquitously displayed portrait of Monsieur le Duc d'Orléans, in which, very unfortunately, he cut a better figure in his uniform as Colonel General of the Hussars than Monsieur le Duc de Berry in his uniform as Colonel General of the Dragoons. That's it. If you want to see a French dragoon, look at World War I photos, early World War I photos, and you'll know what they looked like for 100 years. The city of Paris had the dome of Les Invalides regilded at its own expense. Serious-minded men wondered what Monsieur le Trinquelague would do in this or that event. Monsieur Clauseau de Montal's was at odds with Monsieur Clauseau de Coussergues on a number of points. Monsieur de Salaberry was not pleased. The actor Picard, who was a member of the Academy to which the actor Molière had not been able to gain membership, had Les Deux Philibert staged at the Odeon, on the front of which the Empress Theatre was still clearly legible, although the letters had been stripped off. People took sides for or against Cunet de Montelar. Favier was seditious, Bavot revolutionary. The bookseller Pelissier published an edition of Voltaire under the title Works by Voltaire of the French Academy. It attracts buyers, said this candid editor. The general opinion was that Monsieur Charles Loyson would be the genius of the century. He was beginning to be the subject of envy, an indication of success, and these lines were written about him. Even when Loyson flies, you can tell he has feet. Hugo is playing on a well-known line of verse from Le Fa ou les Usages de l'Année, Canto 1, by the poet and academician, I've never seen that word before, academician, Antoine Marin-Lumière. Oh God, more French. 1733 through 1793. Même quand le sort marche en sans quille a des ailes, even when the bird walks, you can tell it has wings. With Loyson and Le Sceau, a close homophone. And that's the end of that paragraph. Let's begin a new one. As Cardinal Fesch refused to resign, Monsieur de Pin, Archbishop of Amasie, administered the Diocese of Lyon. The dispute between Switzerland and France over the Valley of Dop was sparked by a report by Captain, later General Dufour. Unrecognized, Saint Simon was working on his sublime dream. At the Academy of Sciences, there was a famous Fourier who has been forgotten by posterity, and in some garret or other a little-known Fourier whom future generations will remember. Lord Byron was beginning to make his name. I played Lord Byron in a production, it's an original one, called Mary Shelley and Her Frankenstein. And I think there's not a new production of it. Basically, someone was like, that's a great idea. It's been 10 years. Let's do it again. So I'm excited for that. And, to dad rant for a second, because, there's a lot of book left, and it's basically 11 o'clock. In our interpretation of it, I'll read Frankenstein someday. But in the way I felt about it, at least, like, Byron was a very pretty person. But, like, inside, the guy was a monster. So the creature that Frankenstein makes, the creature, outwardly hideous, sure, but inside, clever, smart, witty, fun. His beauty was on the inside. In my opinion, the creature is Lord Byron, exposed, if you will. It's like, oh no, all of his terribleness is on the outside. And all the things that you think are good about him are actually supposed to be traits, So that's my opinion, at least, of what Mary Shelley was writing. Of course, there's a lot of influences, whatnot, but for me, Byron was like, I'm gonna put this guy in fiction. My cat is trying to send text messages. What other words will spark me to say lots of things? A note to a poem by Millevoye introduced him to France as a certain Lord Baron. David d'Angers was demonstrating his skill at working in marble. Abbe Caron was singing the praises to a small gathering of seminarists in Cul-de-sac de Feuillantine of an unknown priest named Félicité Robert, later to become Lamennais. A thing that emitted smoke and splashed out on the Seine, making a noise like a dog paddling, went to and fro past the windows of the Tuileries, between the Pont Royal and the Pont Louis XV. It was a contraption of not much use, some sort of plaything, the fantasy of an impractical inventor, a chimera, a steamboat. Parisians stared at this piece of futility with indifference. Monsieur de Vaublanc, reformer of the Institute by coup d'etat, royal decree and a change of guard, and distinguished creator of several academicians, having created them, failed to become one himself. Man, we need like the Vulcan Science Academy. We need one of those. of just like, you're smart, you're cool, come to the academy. We're well funded, and we're just gonna make things, and we're not gonna like, let billionaires do this shit anymore. Anyway. The Faubourg Saint-Germain and the Pavillon de Marsan wanted Monsieur Delaveau for prefect of police because of his loyalty. Dupetron and Recamier had an argument in the amphitheater at the School of Medicine and threatened to come to blows over the divinity of Jesus Christ. With one eye on Genesis and the other on nature, Cuvier did his best to please religious reactionaries by reconciling fossils with biblical texts and using mastodons to give credit to Moses. Monsieur Francois de Neufchâteau, admirable promoter of Parmentier's memory, made countless efforts to have pomme de terre pronounced Parmentier, and was utterly unsuccessful. Abbé Grégoire, former bishop, former member of the convention, former senator in the royalist polemical vocabulary, had been downgraded to infamous Grégoire. That word downgraded was denounced as a neologism by Monsieur Royer Collard. Is that the guy from the chapter before? Is that Senator G? Is that man of the convention G? Wow. Telling on himself. This is awesome. Under the third arch of the Pont de l'Anna, you could still distinguish by its whiteness the new stone used to fill the hole for explosives that Blücher had made 2 years earlier to blow up the bridge. The law prosecuted a man who, at the sight of the Comte d'Artois entering Notre Dame, had said out loud, "Oh, for the days when I used to see Bonaparte and Talma going into the Bal Sauvage arm in arm." Seditious talk. 6 months in prison. Traitors were brazen. Men who had defected to the enemy on the eve of battle made no secret of their reward, and went about shamelessly in the light of day with their cynically acquired riches and honors. In the indecency of their paid abjectness, deserters from Ligny and Quatre and Quatre Bras, I noticed I say Quatre because of Gundam Wing, nakedly displayed their devotion to the monarchy. Forgetting what is written on the wall in public conveniences in England, please adjust your dress before leaving. This, in no particular order, is what confusedly serves of that now forgotten year 1817. History neglects nearly all these details, and cannot do otherwise. It would be overwhelmed by their infinitude. Yet these details, wrongly called trivial, there is no trivial fact in the affairs of man, no trivial leaf in the vegetable world, do serve a purpose. The features of the years are what the face of the century is composed of. It was in this year, 1817, that 4 young Parisians had a great lark. And that ends our stream for the night. I'm honestly kind of baffled that my voice still sounds and feels as good as it does right now. Like, I'm not sure what I'm doing to make it this well. Like, as an audiobook person, I can read 20 pages before I'm just done. I'm exhausted and I don't want to read anymore. Tonight we read... About the cheese, there is a Pontellier. Inside Despair, 82 to 112, so 30 pages. It's 10 more pages than I normally do, and I feel great. I'm sure this would go away in 10 minutes. I think it's the fault of the cat. I think this cat's making me sound real good right now. Hopefully it lasts. I'll take good care of my voice. Hey, thanks for sticking around. It's been 2 hours and 8 minutes of me streaming all this silliness, all these miserables. So, yeah, thanks for tuning in. Don't forget patreon.com/hotdadreads. I won't crush you with this book, little guy. Check that out. Pledge, give me money. Come and visit on Saturdays for the super secret Saturday Shakespeare stream. And yeah. Also, smash the like button. There's a little heart in the corner. For Twitch especially. Our Twitch channel, twitch.tv/hotdadreads. Trying to get over 50 followers. We're like 24, 25, so hit that like button, follow us. Don't worry about notifications or anything. We're just trying to get follows. So that way I can take money from Jeff Bezos. But yeah, you're all cool. Thank you so much. Have yourselves an agreeable evening.